Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Hi, this is Kurt Repenchek, your host at National Parks Traveler. This past week, the National Park Service reported that 2019 visitation to the National Park System reached 327.5 million visitors. That's a large number of visitors to the parks. Only time will tell whether Congress becomes motivated by that visitation to seriously address the park system's roughly $12 billion maintenance backlog that impacts visitors, employees, and natural resources. We also reported that Grand Teton National Park's aerial culling of non-native mountain goats was halted by a call from the Wyoming governor, who prefers to see the culling done on the ground by volunteers. And unfortunately, we passed on word about more vandalism in Joshua Tree National Park. You can read those and other stories about national parks and protected areas at nationalparkstraveler.org. In this week's show, we have a wide-ranging discussion about visiting the parks with Jason Epperson, who produces the America's National Parks podcast. We also invited David and Kay Scott, authors of The Complete Guide to the National Park Lodges, to join the discussion. I also talk with Lynn Riddick about her upcoming series of podcasts on the missions of San Antonio Missions National Historical Park. And we end with a recap of our series on the Colorado River and how it impacts Canyonlands National Park and Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. There are 419 units of the National Park System at last count, and 62 units officially branded as national parks. Of course, you also have national seashores, national lakeshores, and national recreation areas. Then, too, there are national monuments, national military parks, national preserves, and national rivers. How do you possibly begin to sort through them all when trying to decide where in the national park system you want to explore? To delve into that question, we've invited Jason Epperson, who along with his wife produces America's National Parks podcast, and David and Kay Scott, authors of The Complete Guide to the National Park Lodges, of which at least 9 editions have been printed. Welcome to the Traveler, all.
Nice to be here.
So this might seem like a simplistic undertaking. I mean, can it really be difficult deciding where in the park system to head?
Well, it depends on the time of year. If it's in the summer when all of the kids are out of school and the families are traveling, that's maybe when you want to avoid some of the bigger parks that'll be jammed and think more of the smaller parks, smaller areas that aren't as busy.
Mm-hmm. The last time we were in Zion, it was which is in Utah. It was essentially a zoo. The parking lot was jammed, and we had to circle the parking lot to eventually find a place to park. That's changed a lot in the last 10 years. Zion is a beautiful park and was, for many people, one of the premier undiscovered parks in the country, I think. But that apparently is no longer the case. So there are a lot of things that should factor into a person's desire and what parks to visit, I think.
Yeah, Zion, I know the shoulder seasons are just about disappearing, and it really is tough to find a good time to visit when you can feel a measure of solitude. Now, Jason, you guys are full-time RVers, so you must be pretty strategic in planning your travels.
We are. So we do try to really play those shoulder seasons up. And during the height of the travel season, we do try to visit some of the lesser known sites. Some of those lesser known sites are every bit as spectacular as the big 62 national parks. And a lot of people just go to the big 62 because they're named national park, but you can get just as great of an experience, if not better, at some of the lesser known places. And sometimes they're right up against the national parks. So you can go to a national monument like Grand Staircase, where it's just massive, and have a blast and really get that solitude. You can get that in the middle of the summer. It's important to realize too that for most of the country, that summer season is the height of travel at a lot of the big parks. But also, in the South, where it can get real hot in the summer, you go to places like Joshua Tree and Death Valley and the Everglades. The summer then is, of course, not the primary travel season.
Yeah, yeah. Now you mentioned the lesser known places, the unbranded national park sites, if you will, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there's this thing about checking off national parks. Not that many people want to check off national lake shores or national seashores. Although I do, because I like the water and I like to paddle. But we've seen a movement in recent years to change the designation of some units that hadn't been national parks. And of course, we've got Indiana Dunes was a lakeshore, now it's a national park. Pinnacles was a national monument, now it's a national park. There are others.
Great Sand Dunes, didn't they change that to a national park, didn't they?
That's been a national park for a while.
White Sands
was another one. And there's talk of rebranding Bandelier National Monument as a national park and preserve, and that seems to be aimed at addressing two things. One, to get that national park branding to help the local economy, to attract more visitors, and also to create a hunting area in the preserve, which is kind of interesting. But what's that going to do in terms of the crowding, Jason? Do you have any thoughts on, will it lessen by creating more national park, quote unquote, will that lessen the crowding in some of these other places?
Well, legislators do this because it works. National park status comes from Congress, and often it's tagged into bills that have no relationship to actually public lands even. But when a national monument or other national park site changes its name to a national park, they do see an increase in visitors, and it's often meant as a way to boost the local economy. I don't think we're seeing anytime soon where these new national parks are making more room at the other ones. But I guess if we have a lot more new national parks, that could happen. And that may very well be coming as more and more legislators realize how well it works and how many people are looking to go around and check off those national parks. The naming system is quite a mess. And that's one of my first lessons to newbie national park travelers, is that you can't go by the name, because it's conflated between whether the Congress made the name up or whether the president at the time came up with the names. People think Joshua Tree is all about trees, and of course it preserves the Joshua trees, but there's so much more. There are a lot of parks that have a name like that that really don't give you an idea of what the whole park is about. And that goes for the national park or national preserve or national monument status as well. So, it's a mess, and we'll see what happens in as they continue to add more parks, and they're certainly doing at a quicker rate than in the past.
David and Kay, I'm imagining, and I'm sorry I didn't leaf through your book this morning, and it's been a while since I looked at it, but there are some park units that you've written about that have lodges that people may not be familiar with, right? Yeah,
there's some of the ones. Well, tell them some of the ones we like, Kay, that aren't in big national parks, but in.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Oregon Caves.
Well,
right, definitely.
There's a nice lodge in Oregon Caves. There's another one in Canyon de Chelly that I don't know if it's never been full when we've been there. It's really a nice place, and it's quiet, and it's an absolutely stunning park.
And you just like the fry bread, though.
Yeah, I do. That's what we usually get that.
Right.
And
now,
then along
Mesa Verde in Colorado isn't
usually
crowded.
not too crowded. And then the Blue Ridge Parkway has 2 lodges, both of which we like. Used to have 4, but they closed 2. And the one on the south end, Pisgah Inn, is actually one of our favorite places to stay, and operates one of the best restaurants in the national park system, I think.
I think another thing newbies might consider is not just going to one spot, but they could possibly go kind of a traveling journey. Like if they went to northern Florida, they could hit around St. Augustine. There's Castillo de San Marcos is in St. Augustine, and then they could work their way down the coast to Canaveral National Seashore and just hit different places. Georgia has also a couple forts in that same vicinity, so they could do that. Arizona, as Jason's going to find out, there are several areas in Arizona close together.
Yeah.
And yeah, like as David mentioned, Canyon de Chelly has a lodge, but the others, Casa Grande Ruins is really neat. We love Montezuma's Castle.
And Walnut Canyon, of course, and Sunset Volcano Crater. I mean, all those make Flagstaff a perfect base camp that you can hit 4 parks in a short amount of time.
And I think that's kind of would be a way to get started, maybe for some of them, if they want to experience the smaller areas.
And I think that could be beneficial, actually, because if you go to Zion on your first visit in July, I think you'll just be overcome by the crowds. You know, as opposed to going to those places and being overwhelmed by the crowds, I think there are a number of park sites that, as you said earlier, Jason, are just as spectacular as the name brand places. I know Dinosaur National Monument is one of my favorite units of the park system because you've got 2 incredible rivers for whitewater rafting. You've got incredible paleontological preserves there, great rugged outdoors. It's just an amazing park, and you don't have the crowds there.
In Wyoming, Devil's Tower is so unique, and it's got a lot of hiking also. And it was crowded as soon as the movie came out, but then the crowds have thinned quite a bit. It's got a great campground. We like that campground at Devil's Tower in Wyoming. And another spot a little further down the road in Wyoming is Fort Laramie National Historic Site. Mm-hmm. We love that one too.
I wish they'd put a campground in.
We do too. Right. But they haven't yet.
No.
I guess they just can't afford that one. One more thing.
Have you ever been to Grand Cours National Historic Site?
Yes.
Yeah, but it's been a while.
Yeah, it has.
When we were coming down from, I love Missoula, and when we were going to Missoula, I think we've been there twice maybe, and
it's in Deer Lodge, Montana.
Yeah. It's really neat. We toured the ranch house, and it's really nice.
It's a museum.
You know, Lyndon Johnson's LBJ Ranch is just, we've probably been there half a dozen times.
Right.
I never get tired of it.
And they do a tour of the home, and it's usually a different person. We learn something new each time we go through. So that's another thing. I would advise people, if there are tours or guided walks and so forth, be sure and take advantage of those because they're usually excellent.
And inexpensive.
Most of the time free, but not always.
Yeah. We've been talking with David and Kay Scott, authors of The Complete Guide to the National Park Lodges, and Jason Epperson, who, along with his wife, produces America's National Parks podcast. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back.
Listener and reader support make National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation via nationalparkstraveler.org. The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, Foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the national park system for decades to come. See their successes at gtnpf.org. RV Share provides not only an option for renters to enjoy the perks of RV travel without having to buy one, but an opportunity for owners to earn income by renting theirs out. You'll find everything from large and luxurious Class A RVs all the way to small and easy-to-tow pop-up campers. You can even use their filters to find an RV that is dog-friendly or one that will be delivered right to your campground. Visit RVshare.com to start your search for the perfect RV rental or to list your RV. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences that it offers endure for generations to come. You can show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org.
So I guess in when you're sitting down and trying to figure out where in the national park system to go, I guess one of the obvious choices you have to make is, are you looking for culture? Are you looking for history? Or are you looking for incredible scenery?
Mm-hmm. Right.
You know that I think that's true for some people, but we really don't care. I mean,
we love everything.
Yeah, whenever we almost never had a bad experience, and each place we've enjoyed, they're all different, and whether they offer culture or scenery, that's fine with us. And it's just always been a rewarding experience when we've gone to a national park area, and we found the people nice, the rangers are helpful, and most of the visitors are pleasant, and they're just nice places to go. They're nice places to spend some time.
Most of the historic places are in the East, Massachusetts, Virginia, Maryland, D.C. area. You'll really have wonderful history there if that's what you're looking for.
And of course, some parks offer all of the above. And I think that's something that is difficult for people who, that we've got 2 weeks off. We're going to want to see as many national parks as possible. This is our big national park road trip. A lot of times they're wanting to get to one, drive through it, move on to the next one. And I think you ought to look at some of the parks that have so much to explore, because some of these places are thousands of square miles. So there's so much to do just making your week-long trip at one national park sometimes, or stringing together some smaller sites. But you have to be careful about putting together a road trip that's going to have you driving as much as you're exploring,
right,
because you'll end up wasting a lot of time.
Yeah, I've been surprised at the number of people who have reached out to the Traveler and said, hey, we want to do Yellowstone and Grand Teton and Glacier in 1 week. What do you suggest?
Yeah, right.
Cut Glacier. You'll be all right.
Well, even cut Grand Teton. But, there's an interesting phenomena going on in the 21st century, and it's this whole Instagram and counting coup with your camera. And I wonder if that doesn't lead some people into trouble. And I say that because I was talking a few years back with the superintendent of Glacier National Park. And, of course, that park was made famous back in the 60s, I think it was, when there were the 2 grizzly bear attacks at 2 fatal maulings of campers. And so, there was this intimidation factor of, gosh, Glacier's a wild place. I got to really know what I'm doing to go there and explore it. And you come up to the 21st century, and people are seeing all these dazzling photos of, Logan Pass and Swift Current Lake and on and on and on, the Grinnell Glacier, and they want to go out and do it, and they may not be prepared for that type of experience.
Right.
Well, I think that's probably true,
Sure.
yeah.
You have to plan to have it, just like any other vacation. You have to plan to get the most out of it. Well gone are the days of hopping in the car and just, living by serendipity and finding what you can along the way, you could still do a bit of that. But traveling through the national parks has become so popular, partly because of this social media aspect. But I think the National Park Service has done a great job of really advertising that, hey, you should make your vacation an American one and come see the parks. And you'd have to, look at the guidebooks. You have to go online, do some research, watch YouTube channels, and learn what are going to be the best hikes for me. What are the best places to stay? How do I get those reservations? When do those reservations open up? When is the best time of year to visit this park? There's a lot. It's like planning a Disney trip. You want to get the most out of your money so that you're not waiting 3 hours in line for a ride. And that's similar at national parks.
Yeah, and if you're going from sea level to a place like Rocky Mountain National Park and going up to the high country, you're going to quickly realize that your lungs aren't tuned up for that type of elevational change.
Well, Jason's right. When David and I first started camping way back in the dinosaur age practically, there wasn't a lot of information out there. And we'd go to a park and kind of have planned our itinerary, maybe 3 days there. And we'd realize there's so much more, why didn't we stay longer? Or why didn't we plan to stay longer? But now the information is available. It's online. It's in guidebooks. It's everywhere. So people really do need to plan before they head out.
But the other side of that is we've taken off a lot of summers when we had a Volkswagen bus, and we would just take off, and we didn't have any plans, and they were great summers. We would run across something that would surprise us, and that was great. We just drove around the country for 3 months, summer after summer, and it was a great life. I really enjoyed that.
But not a lot of people have that opportunity.
No, but I think you can plan too much. And
yeah, if you're willing to just take what comes and change your plan up as much as possible, then you can do that. But if you've got this short amount of time and you must go to Yellowstone and Glacier and Grand Tetons, well, you're going to want to be very careful about that because you're going to want to be able to experience something when you get there. If you don't plan, you may end up, at Zion, you may end up waiting a very long time for a shuttle or standing in line for the Angel's Landing hike, that sort of stuff.
Another thing, Kurt, you might want to talk about is the passes that are available, the national park passes that I don't think everyone knows about those.
No, and they can be a real money saver if you're going to a number of parks in one 12-month period. There's a whole slew of federal recreation passes that are good from the day you buy them, as opposed to a calendar year. I'm fortunate to say that I've reached that age where I've got my senior pass. I'm good for the rest of my life.
You're kidding me.
Hard to believe, isn't it? Yeah.
It is.
Well, and then if a family has a fourth grader, the family gets into the park free.
What I'd like to see is an incentive program, and by that I mean we did a Father's Day trip down to the North Rim of Grand Canyon a couple of years ago, and I had my annual pass at the time, and my two sons each had to pay to get into the park. And it'd be nice if there was an incentive program where if within a week or 2 weeks they took the receipt from that $20 fee, whatever it was, and they could apply that towards an annual pass. I wonder if that wouldn't spur more purchases of the annual passes.
You can do that with a senior pass.
You can.
Now that they've changed the price of the senior pass, right?
It's $20 a year or $80 a lifetime, but you can use the $20 toward the $80 if you can live long enough.
If you hold on to your receipts.
That's always an issue.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, for the first or second time park traveler, what tips should they keep in mind when they're looking to book a room in a park lodge?
Well, you don't want to go into a big park like Yellowstone unless you've got a reservation. You can often find rooms It may not be where you want to stay, but it's just too far to go somewhere else and try to find a room, and you may not be able to find one at all. So you need to book early, and if the rates go down, you can always cancel and rebook. But I think most of them have like a 3-week window where people can cancel. So 3 weeks out, if you haven't been able to find a room, 3 weeks out from when you plan to be there, you might try again. When we were on the road, we were trying to find a room in Bryce Canyon, and we couldn't do it, and we just kept after it, and finally they opened up. But also be flexible. Be flexible. If you you're going to go to Grand Teton, be flexible on where you might want to stay. Don't have your heart set on a particular place, and that's true in Glacier National Park also.
Well, and that's also true with cabins, like cabins with baths and without baths, which you'll find in Yellowstone and some other parks. And if you need to, go ahead and book a cabin without a bath and just keep calling back to check to see if one with a bath has opened up.
Yeah.
So flexibility, I think, is one thing that's important.
No, absolutely it is. I mean, a lot of places you hear, book 6 months out or book 7 months out from your trip. And sometimes you might end up paying the highest rate that the concessionaire will charge. And if you wait a little bit longer, those rates might go down as, occupancy doesn't rise up to expectations.
Right.
Well, and you can always, if you have that high rate and it's come down, it's in your cancellation time. Cancel one and just book at the cheaper rate.
And the shoulder seasons when they're not so busy, if you have the opportunity to travel, then the whole experience can be a lot better. We went to Voyageurs National Park and stayed at Kettle Falls Hotel, and for one night we were the only people there. I think they were in the closing stage of the lodge. Right. We had a great time. It was the weather was good and it was a little cool, but it was, I don't know what month it must have been, September, October.
I think the end of September.
But it was great.
After school vacations ended, and
it
everybody
was.
went back home.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Kids were back in school.
Yeah.
So, Jason, you're a full-time RVer. So what tips can you give other RVers who haven't experienced the national park campground settings?
Well, most of the national park campgrounds are available on recreation.gov. So that's where you want to go to book them. And it's actually a fairly good site. They've retooled it, and you can see all the details about every site, the length, and what days it's available. So what I like to do is go on to recreation.gov and see that calendar of availability for the park. Because if you don't, get your reservation in early enough, most of these National Park Service campgrounds do fill. So you can see what days you might be able to book and, then put in for your vacation time with work or what have you. National parks, a lot of people buy their RV, and the length of their RV is something that often gets talked about when it comes to visiting national parks. And there's a lot of misinformation out there about, what the right length of RV to have for a national park is. The reality is that there actually aren't that many campgrounds for RVs in the 62 national parks. There certainly are some. There are quite a few, but there are a lot more campgrounds available, usually right outside the parks. Often there's a national forest butted up right against the national park. Often there's commercial campgrounds available. So you can always use those as an option as well. But it is nice to stay in national park campgrounds when you can, because you're right there, and often it can be up to an hour drive or more into a park. So for places like Zion, the Watchman Campground is one of the nicest campgrounds in the National Park Service, but it books up quickly. If you can stay there, then you don't have to stay out of the park and take the shuttle to the park and transfer to the other shuttle that takes you into the park. You're right there in town. And whenever you can do that, the better, even if you're not going to have full hookups. So most National Park Service campgrounds are not going to have sewer hookups. The ones that do have sewer hookups are usually operated by a concessionaire, and you're going to pay a premium for those. Usually, you're going to pay similar to what you'd pay at a commercial campground just outside of the park. And usually those National Park Pass discounts, like the Senior Pass and the Access Pass for disabled people, do not apply to concessionaire-run campgrounds. And unfortunately, those are sort of like the best, like Fishing Bridge at Yellowstone and Trailer Village at Grand Canyon. Those sorts of places they're premium. They're the best places to be for the park, but you might end up paying like $50 a night for one of those. So if you're looking at national parks as an affordable camping trip, you're really going to want to be looking at some of those smaller campgrounds, tent camping even, those places where it's just not quite as popular, and stay out of the way a little bit.
Yeah. And if there are RVers out there in the audience today who are curious about national park campgrounds, go to nationalparkstraveler.org and search for RVing the parks. We've got a number of stories written by a full-time RVer like Jason that tackle some of the issues you run into in exploring the parks, including the length of your RV as well as the whether there are hookups or not out there. Recreation.gov. When it works, it's wonderful. Sometimes it doesn't work. We've had a lot of questions, conspiracy theory that there's some black market folks who have figured out how to game the system and reserve a whole block of sites. I know I've had my issues with it. So if you're going the recreation.gov route, tread carefully and pack a measure of patience because it's not the easiest.
One thing to know is, recreation.gov also, it's part of Reserve America. It's sort of a white labeled version of Reserve America, which is a bigger website that has a lot more state parks and even some commercial campgrounds. The issue with public campgrounds, whether it's federal or state, is often that it is very affordable, if not free, to cancel your reservation or move your reservation. So a lot of times when campgrounds open up for booking, people book lots of dates that they don't intend to use.
Yeah.
So usually you'll get really you'll get really concerned when that season opening happens and all the campsites are full, but you will start to see cancellations happening closer to your dates very often. And the way we travel full time, that's how we book most of our National Park Service campgrounds, is at the last minute, because they do have lots of cancellations.
Yeah, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I know the Needles Campground in Canyonlands National Park has 26 sites, and they are golden if you can reserve one of those.
Right.
We've been talking today with Jason Epperson, who produces America's National Parks podcast with his wife. They are full-time RVers traveling the national park system. And David and Kay Scott, authors of The Complete Guide to the National Park Lodges, who over the decades, hate to say that, David and Kay, sorry, have visited all the national parks out there and offer a wealth of advice and information in their book, The Complete Guide to the National Park Lodges. Thank you so much for joining me today, folks. It's been fun kicking around these different issues when it comes to visiting the national parks, and I'd certainly like to regroup maybe 6 months down the road and try it again.
Thanks for having us.
Good. Thanks for the invitation.
Right.
Dry Tortugas National Park, 70 miles off the Florida Keys, just very well might be the most difficult park to reach in the lower 48. But when you arrive, you're surrounded by crystalline waters for snorkeling, scuba diving, fishing, and kayaking. There are sunken wrecks to explore, coral reefs swarming with colorful marine life, and history in the brick walls of a Civil War-era fort. The Yankee Freedom 3, departing from Key West, can get you there in a little more than 2 hours. Visit them at drytortugas.com. The the North Cascades Institute has a large portfolio. It's an environmental learning center, a training center, a conference center, and a leadership center, all set in the splendor of the North Cascades National Park Complex. Learn more at ncascades.org.
Across the country, there are more than 400 units of the National Park System. They protect some of the country's best scenic beauty, along with its rich cultural and historical background. One of those parks is San Antonio Mission's National Historical Park in Texas, which protects and interprets 4 missions that date to the early 18th century. San Antonio resident Lynn Riddick has been preparing a series of 4 podcasts on the park and joins us today to provide a preview into her series. Welcome, Lynn. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, as I mentioned, San Antonio Missions is not your typical national park. What makes it so intriguing and worth visiting?
Well, first of all, the missions here are really the most complete and most intact example of Spain's efforts to control the northern frontier of New Spain. There's so much authenticity that remains in the missions regarding workmanship and materials, even though some parts were restored over the years. There were many missions built all over the American Southwest, as you know, but many have disappeared or fallen into disrepair. The Spanish crown and its agents, who were the Franciscan missionaries, pulled off quite a feat, I think. The missions allowed them to fight off threats to land claim for Spain and take native bands of Indian hunters and gatherers and turn them into Spanish citizens loyal to the king by turning them into Catholics and teaching them how to survive on their own. The missions are unique because they're so close together and they're still in fairly good shape. It was this concentration that allowed the missions to be successful because you've got safety and strength in numbers, and then there's relative ease of the delivery of supplies, the sharing of knowledge, and ultimately the ability of Native people to have a whole new set of skills that enabled them to be independent and thrive.
Wasn't that kind of presumptuous, though? I mean, hadn't the native cultures survived there for centuries? Why did the missionaries think they could do a better job of it?
That's a great question, because you do wonder about the native people that live there. And it was a hard life. They were starving. They were worried about food all the time. They were roaming around trying to move with the seasons and trying to find the best place to live and eat. And, they had to worry about the weather. You have diseases from Europeans coming into the bands of Indians and taking its toll on them. So I think from what I have learned, they were very willing to see what life would be in the missions. And once they saw that it provided some sustenance and some security, more and more Native people were willing to join into the mission life.
Yeah. Now, there at San Antonio, you've got 4 missions in the park itself, and then there's also the Alamo, which is a state of Texas park. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's owned by the state of Texas.
Yeah. So how are the 4 missions, and maybe even including the Alamo, how are they different, or are they different?
Well, they are different. First of all, they all look different, even though you kind of might expect them to look the same since they were founded roughly during the same time period and built so close together. For example, each mission was basically built within a square or a rectangular shape with walls all around the perimeter, and there was a large grassy central plaza in the middle, which is still there. Each mission has a church, and each of the churches look different from each other. They are still in good shape and functional, although there have been restorations made over the years. And with the exception of Mission San Jose, the authenticity of the materials used in the reconstruction and design and even the workmanship are still there. The limestone structures still standing in each mission are also different. At Mission San Juan, there's remnants of a church that was never completed and remnants of a burial site, which the other missions don't have. And I think the thing to think about during a visit is what the Native people might have been like, and like we were talking about, what conditions they were having to endure to be led to leave such a different way of life, and what kind of a transition they must have gone through to learn so many things that they had never seen before. Imagine having to learn to cut stone or milk a goat or carpentry or cutting trenches to reroute the water for crops. So that's something to think about when you visit the missions. And I also like to think about what the Franciscan friars were going through, how challenging it must have been for them as well, trying to teach a specific set of religious doctrine and rules and religious events to folks that didn't speak the language. And they had to have been dedicated and patient, but they probably had to be pretty strict too.
Yeah. Are the missions within walking distance of each other?
They are. They're 2 or 3 miles apart, and you can walk. So
each one is 2 or 3 miles apart?
Yeah. So if you like to walk, it's a nice walk in between. And some parts of the river between, when I say river, I mean the San Antonio River, some parts have been restored with walkways. So if you don't actually walk to and from the missions, definitely take a walk along the restored part of the San Antonio River.
Now, with 4 missions there, it sounds like you could spend a lot of time exploring this national park. Any suggestions on how long visitors should set aside for their exploration of the missions?
I would say if you like taking your time, you can easily see all the missions in 4 or 5 hours. You can do them faster than that, of course. But if you start with Mission San Jose, which is in the second of the chain going south from the Alamo, you can have the option of going into a visitor center and watching a movie or seeing the museum that's there. And it really is the only of the 4 missions in the park that is staffed by National Park rangers. So you can take a ranger-led tour. The other missions are not staffed, so you can explore on your own. Sometimes you might stumble upon a volunteer who's giving an informal tour.
Is there any particular order? I mean, besides hitting San Jose mission first?
No, just follow the line. They're not too far apart, so you can do them in any order that you want, and you're not going to miss out on anything if you do them out of order.
Yeah, yeah. Now, of course, you live there in San Antonio, and I'm sure you've been to the missions countless times. You're going to help bring them alive, so to speak, to our audience. You've been able to capture some incredible sounds already, haven't you?
I have. Yeah, I was able to catch a Sunday mariachi service. I got some nice sound of the church bell tolling and some of the tours going on. So I'm looking forward to presenting this story of what happened in San Antonio, because what's really unique about it and what really makes it a UNESCO World Heritage Site, in addition to a National Historical Park, is that the cultural significance here is so exceptional. The story of Spain's lasting influence on this area through the merging of cultures is what the missions are all about. The lasting Tejano culture that lives and thrives today in San Antonio, with people and life centered on faith and families and music and food. I mean, that's the genesis of San Antonio, and the fact that it's the cultural significance is so exceptional and really priceless and irreplaceable, and it's very much worth holding on to and protecting for future generations.
Yeah, and you were able to catch up with some of the park staff there to help tell this incredible story.
I did. I've talked to Tom Castanos, who is the educational coordinator and a park ranger there, and he's so super knowledgeable. He has a great grasp of history. He knows so many facts. He's seen documents that the friars had to put together 300 years ago, and he just is a great source of information and very interesting to listen to.
Now we're going to kick off your series next weekend, and it's a 4-part series. What are you going to start us off with?
So we're going to start with Mission San Jose, and that is the only mission that has had extensive reconstruction, and that's because it really lends to a better visual experience for people that are coming to visit there. It shows you how the walls actually were, how the bastions were, some of the facilities and living quarters. So we're going to walk through there and talk about some of the features there with Tom Costanos. And we're going to talk about the indigenous people and what brought them to the missions and how they got started with building the missions and building the gardens and creating the ranches and getting started. So that's what we're going to do first. The second piece will be on Mission Concepcion, and I'm going to talk and delve a little bit more into how the specific teachings regarding religion happened and how the teaching of other skills came about. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the architectural features of the missions as well.
You know, I hate to admit it, but I've never been to the San Antonio Missions National Historical Park. It's on my to-do list, and it's jumped up a few levels just talking to you about what you've experienced there, and really looking forward to how your series comes together and what we learn from it. Is there any one particular time of year that is especially worth visiting the missions?
Well, that's hard to say because there are things happening all year round. For example, there's a Music Under the Stars summer concert series fundraiser. There's a Mexican art show and sale. This is really interesting. There's a ranger-led bike ride to see the migrations of monarch butterflies coming up from Mexico to the northern part of the United States. That sounds really fascinating. There's healthy heart walks. There's yoga twice a month. So there's a lot going on most of the year. To me, what is really nice, and it's happened to me several times when I've gone to the mission, is that I've chanced upon a mass being celebrated in one of the churches. And that's something you really don't expect. I don't know if you've ever walked into a basilica or a cathedral in Europe when mass was being said. And to me, it's just a special feeling to know that despite all the grandeur and history and all of the art and wood carvings and elaborate floor tiles and visitors who come to see all that, the church continues to be an important place of worship for local people. And that's the same feeling you get here if you stumble upon a mass, although I have to say that the churches are very small and very modest compared to anything you're going to see in Europe. And here's a tip. If you want to try to get there and observe a mass or participate in a mass, you have to either be there on time or just be satisfied peeking through the door because they don't allow visitors to pop in and out during services.
That's good to know. That's good to know. Well, Lynn, I really appreciate that sneak peek into the San Antonio Missions National Historical Park. And I must say that just listening to that sneak peek, I'm really looking forward to your series. And it's raised San Antonio Missions up a number of spots on my National Park to-do checklist.
Thanks, Kurt. I really appreciate the opportunity to share what I've learned about the park, and hopefully we'll get you here someday.
Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to deepen the public's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at WNPF.org.
During the past 2 weeks, Patrick Cohn produced a series of stories that looked at how the health, or the lack of health, of the Colorado River impacts Canyonlands National Park and Glen Canyon National Recreation Area in Utah. Those stories were made possible through a grant from the Water Desk at the Center for Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado. We conclude this series with what we're calling Voices from the River. Patrick interviewed state and government officials, as well as area residents and river runners for his series. What follows are some of the poignant thoughts those individuals relayed to Patrick.
Mike DeHoff has long guided whitewater trips on the Colorado River to Canyonlands National Park. He and some of his compatriots are watching as some rapids, which have been long buried by the waters of Lake Powell, are re-emerging.
So Cataract Canyon is a 41-mile stretch of river below the confluence of the Green and the Colorado. It used to be, when Lake Powell was completely full, it inundated 65% of the canyon. And you would run the big drops, which are some of the biggest rapids in the canyon. And sometimes while you were scouting the last big drop, you would see jet skis and houseboats or what have you. And around 2000, that all changed. There was a big drought, and the reservoir receded 100, 150 feet in a very rapid rate. And we started seeing rapids come back out. We started seeing the river flowing across its own sediments, and it slowly was carving those out. And we thought that this was just going to be a very short-term thing, and the lake was going to go back up to its regular reservoir level. But that didn't happen. And over the course of the last 15 years, the river has slowly started carving back more and more rapids in that area. 5 years ago, a few of us really noticed that things were changing and that kept on changing. Myself, two other guys, Bago Gerhardt and Peter Lefebvre, we one day said to each other, wow, someone should really be keeping track of how much things are changing down there. And it was Pete who said, have you ever seen that movie Chasing Ice about the glaciers receding up in Alaska? And I said, yeah, I've seen that movie. It was a great movie. He said, I wish someone did that with what's going on down in Cataract Canyon. And after a while, we figured out that all of us, myself, Bago, and Peter, were all taking pictures of the changes that were happening. And we decided to start putting them all together. We then started matching all these photos that we had with places that we could tell were pre-reservoir affected. And then we also got our hands on old guidebooks and old river maps to help tell us where rapids before the reservoir were. And just to answer the simple question of when are other rapids going to come back, where are they going to come back, and what are they going to look like when they do. So in the spring of 2019, we knew there was going to be really high water down in Cataract Canyon. We also knew that there was a very good chance that Gypsum Canyon Rapid could come back out because the reservoir was really low. So we contacted Glen Canyon National Recreation Area and got a scientific monitoring permit to be able to put a time-lapse camera at Gypsum Canyon Rapid. And it has been rolling down there since we put it in March. Gypsum Canyon Rapid has come back to the point of being a riffle right now. And we think it's within 10 feet of being back out in its actual location. Granted, there's still got to be a lot of mud that moves from it. It really is happening right before your eyes. Yeah. Like we literally could see banks collapsing. You could see how silt is getting flushed out of river or side streams and the side canyons. It's all just trying to restore itself down there.
Terry Fisk is the Chief of Resource Stewardship and Science for the Southeast Utah Group of National Parks, which includes Canyonlands.
Climate change plays in is that, we can't really depend on the past as a guide to what to expect in the future. I don't know right now that we can point to any particular thing that has happened as a result of climate change related to water. But I think the next couple of decades going to be critical for us and interesting, but probably not interesting in a very satisfactory way. Global circulation models, the ensemble models that are looked at, the Four Corners area, and and in particularly San Juan County and Grand County, Utah, we're already at 2 degrees C above pre-industrial. So we're going into situations right now in our parks where the historical record, we're in the 98th, 99th percentile of that record for, say, mean warmest temperatures over a month, warmest minimum temperatures over a month. So, the difference between now and what the tree ring data can tell us is that we're in an unexplored environment for CO2 in the atmosphere and so on that we really haven't experienced in quite a few million years. We're interested in with, say, the changes that we do not want to see on the river and the changes that we would like to prevent is long-term reduction in flow that has a negative effect on ecosystem function, whether that's T&E species or riparian communities, cottonwood galleries, those kinds of things. And I don't know that we can really prevent that, but we need to be able to mitigate to the best of our ability. In the last 20 years, we have seen in Canyonlands and other reaches on both the Green and the Colorado is that channel narrowing and channel simplification. We have overall less sediment coming into the rivers from the big basins, but then episodic inputs from smaller tributaries. So we are looking at climate change and what the potential effects of climate change will be on our vegetation community, and broadly defined grasslands, shrublands, and then pinyon juniper woodlands. Do we have some species that can be fairly well adapted or could be induced to be adapted to warmer conditions, more arid conditions? See huge areas where juniper's been really stressed in the last couple of years. So it seems quite spotty, but fairly widespread.
Professor Jack Smith is the director of the Center for Colorado River Studies at Utah State University.
Lake Powell is the second largest reservoir in the United States, a very close second to Lake Mead. What we know is that there will be an ever decreasing amount of water flowing into Lake Powell. But what we also know is it'll be highly variable. There will be more drought years than big water years. Every once in a while, it'll be a big winter and we'll get a big snow year. Those will be fewer, but they will still come, so it'll be highly variable. It's about how society makes decisions about what to do with that water. The fate of the reservoir is contingent partly on climate change and partly on society's response to climate change. You could preferentially store your water, albeit less water, but you could preferentially store it in Lake Powell. Thereby, Powell would be full. You could preferentially store it in Lake Mead, and Lake Powell could be empty almost all the time. Right now, what we do is we keep the contents of Powell and Mead equal. So you basically operate the two reservoirs as if they're one, except that politically the Lake Powell is in the upper basin, Lake Mead is at the lower basin. There's political shenanigans. So the fate of Lake Powell and the fate of Glen Canyon NRA and the centerpiece of its reservoir is determined by the political agreements about how to share the pain of drought. The renegotiation of that pain, it's those kind of negotiations that will carry the fate of Glen Canyon NRA, which now has the centerpiece of reservoir recreation. Reservoir recreation is going to be the furthest thing from anybody's mind. It's pretty much an irrelevancy. Longer and more intense droughts will come, and therefore The only focus of management of Lake Powell will be to do whatever it takes to meet the needs of 40 million people, not any houseboat person. And to assert otherwise is just to be silly. It's about consumptive uses and losses. I really think that it's important to not say, oh, the Green River's changed because of Flaming Gorge Dam. So if one cares about the integrity of the Green River in Canyonlands, then one cares about how water is managed in the Yampa River Basin. On the Colorado River side, well, I think 520,000 acre-feet of water is diverted to the Colorado Front Range. Climate is warming. There is a strong correlation between a warming climate and decreased runoff in the Colorado River.
John Weisheit is the Colorado River keeper.
Is the Colorado River healthy? The answer is no. The demands on the Colorado are too extreme. We're suffering potential shortages, reservoirs going empty, hydropower stopping, downstream ecosystems below dams crashing from water that's too warm, from invasive species, lack of sediment for beaches, changing national park dynamics all throughout the basin. And so, what do we do about this? People want to make changes because they think climate change is going to diminish flows. And yeah, that's all true, but climate has extremes. It has large floods. Can our dams and reservoirs manage these things? Is there a possibility that this infrastructure could be damaged? Would 40 million people be disappointed? My position is we just need to adapt to climate. We've never adapted to climate. We assume what our climate hydrology is without really looking at it in the broader term of history, which can only be answered by paleoclimatologists. So we need to pay attention to these people and get a realistic idea of what the Colorado River or what it can do and what it can't do.
The other thing that alarms me is the snow levels between 8,000 feet and 10,000 feet are very different. That snow usually melts and doesn't hang around. I think it was really obvious this year. We had a good snowpack, but it all came from 10,000 feet and above. The other thing that's alarming is the monsoons have changed. That moisture is really important to Arizona, New Mexico, the Grand Canyon, Utah kind of gets residual monsoons, but it's important to our highlands and our high desert. And that's going away. They're not as frequent when they do come. It's not as much volume. So that's actually the buzz in the science community. They don't really have an answer for it quite yet. There's not a lot of cottonwood generation going, but what we call peach-leaf willow in Utah, Grand Canyon people call it Gooding's willow. It's off the charts. There's thousands, I used to be able to count these plants on my two hands. Extreme enduring drought and extreme floods, because those two things could bring the whole system down. And what are you going to tell 40 million people? We're sorry. We just need to adapt to climate. We've never done it in our history. It's about time.
Marlon Duke works for the Bureau of Reclamation and explains how climate change might change the operations of Glen Canyon Dam.
We operate Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam at Lake Mead. We operate those two reservoirs together, which means we coordinate their operations so that we can balance the contents of the reservoir. It's really difficult to forecast accurately what's going to happen next week, 2 weeks, let alone 2 years or 5 years down the road. How much water are we going to be releasing from Glen Canyon Dam? Is Lake Mead going to be operated under any kind of a shortage condition? There's always an opportunity to make adjustments based on the real snowpack that we get over the winter. We have 8 generators at that power plant at Glen Canyon. At any given time, we might have a generator or 2 that are down for routine maintenance. That facility provides the water storage account for the upper basin. So the upper basin states have certainty and reliability and can provide that certainty and reliability to the lower basin in the form of obligated water flows under the 1922 Compact. How this all started was a need to store water. There's a lot of attention right now on climate change and what that means. The best that the climate scientists can tell us right now is that things are probably going to be more variable, and as weather patterns change, it might mean that our rain or our water comes more in the form of rain than it does snow. We're 19 years into one of the worst droughts in recorded history, and we've gotten 19 years in, and we have not had to have any kind of significant, big shortage declarations on the river. And I think that that's a testament to the value that these reservoirs bring to the 40 million people who rely on water from the Colorado River. We can store 4 times the annual flow of the river behind these dams, and that has really been the saving point for this basin over these 19 years of drought.
Taylor Hawes with the Nature Conservancy is the Colorado River Program Director.
We are overusing the river. We're, using more than the river provides. 50 to 100 years, we've allocated about 17.5 million acre feet, and the river's been providing about 12.5 acre feet. So we've got this, what we call the math problem. We can flex when we have these continued dry times and adapt to this drier future that we're expecting. And recognizing this is a really variable system, so we will probably still have good years here and there, and how can we make sure that we can optimize those good years and survive the dry years? Basically, the decision makers in the Colorado River Basin over the last 100 years ignored the science. This has always been a variable system, and it's getting more variable. So we're seeing, bigger swings every year. We just can't predict how this is going to go, and we could, fall off the cliff next year. The system, continues to get drier steadily, and the monsoons are completely disruptive and erratic. The greater demands, greater reliance on our reservoirs, so drawing those reservoirs down, end up putting us in a hole for the coming year that most people we're not quite thinking about yet.
Scott Vanderkoy with the U.S. Geological Survey is the chief of the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center.
I mean, it has to do with, the amount of water that's, precipitation that's coming into the Southwest. Likely the form of that water, because timing of runoff matters, whether it's coming in snow or rain. So it's not only the amount, but the type of precipitation, in terms of runoff, and the timing of that runoff as well. Yeah, how full that reservoir is matters a lot, because it's, the temperature of the water that comes down. It's also the nutrient content. Changes have been really rapid. Essentially we've been dealing in a really long-term drought in the Southwest, essentially since 2000. And we periodically have wet years in that mix, but a lot less water coming into those reservoirs. And, what we have seen as particularly Lake Powell, as that has lowered, that's affected water quality that's released, the quality of the water that's released from the dam. Water temperature controls all biological processes in rivers. In a point where the water coming out of the dam is relatively warm versus what it was, say, when the reservoir was full back in the 80s and 90s. The range is previously when the reservoir was full, the temperatures we would see we're probably would peak out at maybe 10 or 11 degrees Celsius. This year, dam releases peaked at 16 degrees Celsius. But in other years, we're still seeing temperatures 13 to 14 degrees C. We're in a really good area, we kind of call it a Goldilocks zone, to where temperatures are warm enough that the native fish can grow, can reproduce, do well in the main stem river, but it's not so warm that it advantages warm water invasive species that we do not want. Things like smallmouth bass, northern pike, walleye. As that reservoir drops, further up in the reservoir, there's sediments that have been deposited when the reservoir was full. And so lower down, you get big influxes of runoff, and they resuspend that sediment. That can affect water quality down in the reservoir, in turn can affect water quality.
This podcast is part of a series of articles on the Colorado River and its impacts on national parks in Utah. It was supported by a grant from the Water Desk, an independent journalism initiative based at the University of Colorado Boulder's Center for Environmental Journalism.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. Next week, Lynn Riddick will be back with her first installment on San Antonio Mission's National Historical Park. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling national park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcast. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.